Welcome everyone to Citizen Climate International's Get to Know Us call, the first series of them in 2024. This is time number 2. We meet circa the third Wednesday of every month. And this is at COP28, this picture on the right. And these are my colleagues, from Rituraj from India, Gloria from Nigeria, that's myself, as well as Scovia from Rwanda. And this was a beautiful display at COP28 called the Dance of Unity. And it's a Romanian sculpture. It's just absolutely stunning. So today's agenda, we just did our introductions. We'll briefly review the history, mission, and culture of Citizens Climate International. We will look back at basically the IPCC, what happened at COP28, and then a little bit with this crazy change in the global temperatures that we're experiencing. And then we'll look ahead to 2024. We'll do an introduction to the EnROADS policy simulator. We'll do a primer on redirecting financial flows. I'll go a little bit deeper on carbon pricing, how we work, and how to get involved. Our solution to climate change is people, so thank you for being on our team. Our learning objectives is, I hope by the end of this, you learn our history, mission, core values, and the way we do things. As well as understand why we focus on carbon pricing and redirecting financial flows. I heard a lot of great things about rail and transportation and lots of local initiatives. But I hope by the end you'll get a better understanding of why our focus is on building this political will for redirecting financial flows and visioning 2024 while keeping in mind progress we made in 2023 globally, as well as Citizen Climate International's niche. We support volunteers in developing their political will locally for most countries, carbon pricing, especially everyone here on the call. I mean, if you're from Europe or Canada, yeah, that's our focus is carbon pricing. So our mission is to create the political will for a livable world by enabling individual breakthroughs in the exercise of their personal and political power. At Citizens Climate International, our mothership is Citizens Climate Lobby, which was founded in 2007. We have over 21,000 supporters outside the USA, and they are from 204 countries. We have nodes in 76 countries, with 51 of them having active chapters. Last check, it was 150 active chapters. Just last week, we activated Tanzania, as well as South Sudan, another chapter in Uganda, and another chapter in Cameroon. Canada joined the Citizens Climate Lobby Network in 2010, being the first non-US American country to join, and Australia and Sweden in 2013. And by 2015, we were connecting globally. And we became a legal entity in the United States 3 years ago. Our founder was Marshall Saunders, and he realized that ordinary people like me and you would have to organize, educate ourselves, get our hopelessness, and gain the skills to be effective with our governments. Marshall was a dream master. He knew that it was people like you and me speaking truth to power and embracing our democracy was where the change was going to happen. He bet the ranch on us, and very generous human being. I wish you could have met him. It's remarkable. He passed away in 2019, and I miss him. We have 4 defined program areas at Citizens Climate International. As director of programs, my major area of focus is supporting our incredible volunteer policy advocates in their work in their countries or their parts of the world, mostly focused on building political will for carbon pricing. Do a lot of carbon pricing work, but also redirecting financial flows a little bit as well, doing some work trying to get money away from fossil fuels that are, destroying the planet, as well we are accredited at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 2014. I've been going since 2017. We're also accredited at the UN Biodiversity COPs, as well as the World Bank, the IMF, etc. And we also have a portion of our program in where there is some research done and publications made, and that's this area here, kind of like the policy wonk area. But for most part, when you join us, unless you really get into the civic diplomacy and the resilience, the policy wonk stuff, most of our work is focused here on the left, and that's mostly what I'll be talking about today. As I talk about the work that we do, I just want to at the forefront say that human rights and citizen engagement are our starting points. It is critical that human rights be embedded into everything, that all these policies that are being made nationally and internationally. And when we go to the United Nations, we push to make sure that this is in the documents as well, by our very nature, because we train citizens to speak to politicians. Citizen engagement is also our starting point. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. This last year was surprisingly hot. On July 1st, it got really hot, and then on July 2nd, it was even hotter. And then in November, the global temperatures twice pushed above 2 degrees Celsius. It's not explainable. We are in an El Nino year, but it is not an El Nino cycle. It is not normal for the temperatures to go so high at the beginning of an El Nino. An El Nino builds up. So why this is happening is not explainable. If you search through the literature that was happening as this was happening, you'll hear words like gobsmacked. Scientists don't know what's happening. And what I'm about to present to you is not consensus science, but it is peer-reviewed science. And it is by the top scientists for climate change on the planet, grandfather of climate change, Dr. James Hansen, and global scientists. So I think we all need to keep our eye on 2024 on this concept of sulfur termination shock. So there's all sorts of molecules in the atmosphere. Some cause global warming and some actually cause global cooling. And one of them is sulfur. And sulfur is produced when metals are smelted, or when coal is burnt, or when bunker fuels are burnt in those big transport ships on the oceans. And what's happening right now is there is very strong sulfur mitigation policies. There's a lowering of sulfur in the fuels, the bunker fuels, as well as scrubbing of the sulfur dioxide out of the processes. So there's been a significant decrease in the SO2 aerosols in the atmosphere, but SO2 cools the planet. So as we are, pulling this SO2 out of the atmosphere, we are unmasking more heating in the pipeline, so to speak. So Dr. James Hansen has actually started warning in about May of this year, and finally got his paper published in November, that there is more global warming in the pipeline. So I think we all need to keep an eye on what this means, because it could mean that there's more global warming and things are going to happen even faster. So we cannot ignore this. The precautionary principle alone would require us to look at this. This is something we introduced our volunteers to in November as soon as it was published. This is the sort of work we do. We run out ahead of things, but I was wondering if there were any questions about it before I continued. How many here have heard of it? Yeah, Janet, go ahead.
I read about it in passing, and I'm just curious whether Michael E. Mann had any comments on that topic as well.
See, yeah, that's why it's controversial. And there's a difference between Michael Mann and Dr. James Hansen. Dr. James Hansen is a planetary scientist who studied why Venus overheated? Why is Venus hotter than Mercury, even though it's farther away from the sun? Whereas Michael Mann is a climate scientist. So Dr. James Hansen takes a full global view of all the, planetary things, whereas so they're going to meet at different levels. So Michael Mann, I don't want to say he's dismissive of it, but he's not nearly as alarmed. He wants to build hope, and I respect his approach. Yeah. So yes, Michael Mann has spoken about it, and he's definitely said not to worry about it. But it's Dr. James Hansen alongside a lot of very important scientists, and I think again this is something we need to keep our eye on, because we can't explain why it was so warm. Why were the Great Lakes only 2% covered in ice when they should have been 30% covered in ice by January 1st? This is why is Lake Ontario 2 degrees above normal? Why are the oceans warmer than normal? And what this has in store for us. We need to be able to explain this. I'm not saying this is why, but this is something, if Dr. Hansen says we should be looking at it, I think we should be looking at it. Yes. Thanks for all those
Thank you.
nods, Janet. I felt heard. That was perfect. Okay, go ahead, Marianne.
Well, I also think the stalling jet stream is a contributor. Yeah, big time, because I can remember living in Terrace, like every third day or so we would get some rain, and I never had to really water my garden. And now we're getting heat domes and polar vortex, even in Texas. And I think that that's also due to climate change in our atmosphere. But I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Yeah, as the planet warms, it actually weakens the jet stream, which means it doesn't move. It gets wonkier and it doesn't move as fast, and it just hovers over places, and we just don't get the same weather patterns that we used to. Absolutely, Marianne. And yeah, those heat domes are terrifying. And thanks for bringing them up. We got to face this monster together. And Catherine, I saw you put up your hand.
Yeah, I presume that if we had a lot of volcanic activity, that would redress the balance of the sulfur. I mean,
Only temporarily, because it comes out of the atmosphere faster. But for those of us who were alive in 1982 might remember when Pinatubo blew, it was a little bit cooler that year, but it doesn't stay up nearly as long as the CO2. So yes, with volcanic activity, we need a pretty big one. It might restore things. So, but we do need to be pay attention to how, because to be honest, as I understand it, Dr. Hansen is, and in that paper, they're saying that the IPCC models don't include the global cooling gases as they're making their predictions. And I went to those IPCC meetings in 2017. So there's a missing piece in this puzzle that we need to keep our eye on. And thanks for being bearers of bad news. Being able to hold this bravely in your heads. So the sulfur termination shock, I think, is something we have to keep our eyes on in 2024 as we navigate what potentially could be even hotter year than last year, and last year was horrendous. Yeah, we don't know why, but we just gotta know what this could be a reason why. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so now we're going to go to the IPCC, I believe. Yes. So consensus science. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in the year 1990. It's had 6 assessment reports, cycles. They're called ARs. So we just went through AR6, the 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC. I was at the plenary that launched the 6th cycle in 2017. Here is what was concluded in the last report of the AR6, of the last report of the IPCC assessment report 6th cycle. So there was 3 special reports, and then there were 3 other reports. And then they did a synthesis of all the science that came out in March in 2023. And with business as usual, and remember, this was reported in March, we will reach the 1.5C early in the next decade. But we are at 1.48 in 2023. So we're getting really close. And if the El Nino pans out the way it looks like it will, we will breach 1.5C this year. So it's actually even happening even faster. And that's why I bring up the sulfur termination shock, because we need to, have an idea of what might be happening. So this is really shocking. We will be able to, we will overshoot the 1.5C, but with all the right policies in play, we will get below 1.5C in this century with the right policy frameworks. But now, because things are happening faster than anticipated, the 2018 1.5C report said that we must reach net zero globally by 2050. But now, in the last AR6 synthesis report that came out in March, all developed economies such as Canada, the UK, the United States, the European Union, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, we must reach true net zero by 2040. And by true, I mean none of these bogus policies like carbon capture and sequestration and offsets that aren't validated. Like, it has to be validated ways of sinking carbon. And we must stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure now. This is the physical reality that we live in and that we must abide by according to the IPCC. I sit in on all the media stuff when these are released. So on the last one, I was listening very carefully, knowing that it's about a $3 to $5 trillion transformation we need per year that we need to go through in this decade, in the midst of a affordability crisis, in the midst of a war in Ukraine, in the midst of now seemingly Iran doing all sorts of horrible things in the Red Sea to even further exacerbate the affordability crisis. How are we going to pay for this? Okay, but there is sufficient global capital to rapidly reduce the greenhouse gas pollution that's coming from burning fossil fuels if barriers are reduced. We just need to follow that money. And what global capital is, it's all the savings and investments held by banks, pensions, financial institutions, governments, and individuals. So yes, there is enough money. Definitely the global north can do this, no problem. We will need to assist our brothers and sisters and friends in the global south to help them along, because they have greater barriers due to the colonial structures of our financial system. And we learned a lot about that last year. So hold on. I'm going to be repeating myself a lot in different ways. But before I talk about redirecting financial flows, I just want to say that after COP28, we are on track for about a 2.5C of warming. And we have to be very careful of these abated solutions like carbon capture and sequestration and offsets. The reason why it went up 0.1 degree higher is Indonesia actually is building more coal, and too many countries are putting forth these unproven carbon capture and sequestration policies as part of their ways they're doing things, as well as offsets. They're just not validated. So we are still on track for 2.5C of warming. And you'd think somebody who sees all this stuff would be a little bit disturbed. I'm not, because 1.5C is still alive. The transition away from fossil fuels is now embedded into the COP, into the United Nations documents. This will require our governments to actually show every year how they are transitioning away from fossil fuels. And this needs to be happening in an accelerated way. But we still need the policies that will allow for a fossil fuel phase out that will be fair, fast, forever, and funded. All right. And why do we focus so much on fossil fuels? It's because they are 85% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, lots of good news and lots of great tracks were laid down at COP28. These were just some of the commitments. And if you ever want to see all of them, I can I'll just put this in the chat. They this is the commitments that were made at COP. For those of you who want to get wonky and feel a little bit hopeful that countries are working very hard to put together a framework and a pathway that will get us to 1.5C. There was all sorts of declarations, and you can click on them and discover more about whether your country was in them and what it meant. One of the ones that gave me a ton of hope was this joint declaration on international taxation and at COP28. This will help pay for the loss and damage that is highly underfunded, as well as the adaptation. So that's just one area of hope. So lots of complexity, lots of tracks being laid down. And what we need to do is make polluters pay and have significant redirection of financial flows. So there needs to be subsidy reform. We need to make polluters pay. We need to regulate our domestic banks. We need to reform the multilateral development banks. We need tax reform, and we need a global treaty to unwind from fossil fuels. That's how we're going to pay for this and make it happen. And things are happening. And you can tell from COP28 that it is. But each of us in our own countries has to help push this. I highlight Make Polluters Pay because that is the big chunk of what we do at Citizens Climate Lobby. And people that join us often want us to do other things. And for the most part, this is our big focus. Here in Canada, we do look at regulating the domestic banks. I know that our colleagues in the UK also helped us on a campaign last year with reforming the multilateral development banks. We should all be looking at subsidy reform and tax reform in our own countries to help pay for all the things we need to transform. And absolutely, we need a global treaty to unwind from fossil fuels. So I'm going to say this in another way, that we can transform our world without burdening the taxpayer. Firstly, we must acknowledge the fact that 85% of dangerous greenhouse gas pollution comes from burning fossil fuels. And I can imagine a world without burning fossil fuels for transportation, electricity, and heating and cooling our homes. It's already starting to happen, and it's going to be a much cleaner and better world. But to do this, all of our governments must enact policies that will redirect financial flows away from fossil fuels and towards a sustainable and equitable world. Canada has already begun doing this, and so have other countries. Actually, 48 countries have a price on pollution from fossil fuels. We just have to get it stronger and going up predictably over time. So governments must enact policies that make polluters pay while at the same time give the money back to the people. This is Canada's carbon pricing policy. And to get that price up high enough, we have to give the money back to the people. This will prevent protests as the price rises. And governments, as you'll see, must stop subsidizing our destruction with planet-killing subsidies, and they must enact policies that will regulate the banks and insurance companies so they align with the financing for a livable world for all, and to pay for the adaptation, loss and damage, and the jobs that will be created and the infrastructure. We all need to be looking at tax reform in our own countries as well as internationally. This is the path forward to pay for it, without considering the philanthropy. That's another area, but we don't get into that because governments can't regulate what donors do, but it's a good idea to also keep that in mind. So here's some things. So 2 years ago, this paper was published by Business for Nature, and they found that governments were financing the destruction of nature at $1.8 trillion a year or 2% of the global GDP. By subsidizing fossil fuels at $640 billion a year, agriculture at 520 billion. Like, these are subsidies that are, that are not good for the environment, and they could be making better subsidies so that this didn't happen. There's subsidies for water that is destroying the environment that are at this amount of money. So we need to, our countries all need to look at how they're subsidizing the industries and redirect that money. That's a great pool of money to help pay for loss and damage, adaptation, etc. As well, oops, sorry, I'll just be 1 second. Sorry, lots happening in my house. Sorry about that. So we need to redirect financial flows. So we need our governments to like look at investing in nature. It's currently, as well as private companies. Currently, it's only 200 billion, but we need. We are currently have investments of $7 trillion per year in activities that have a negative impact on nature from both private and public sector sources, roughly 7% of the global GDP. And this is just not good. We need to get our financial institutions, both the World Bank and our domestic banks, to stop doing this. And we need to create regulations and policies that will make this stop. This is, and imagine not losing 7% of our global GDP from bad investments. That would put more money back into the economy. Another area is food, and it does overlap with the other two, but we lose 10% of the global GDP annually due to bad practices within our food and agricultural areas. A lot of that is fossil fuels. We need to get most of the fossil fuels out of the agricultural sector. In fact, all of it, probably, yes, all of it. But there's also losses due to food waste, as well as health problems. We subsidize bad food for people. So again, imagine, like, there's all sorts of money that we could be getting if we just restructure our subsidy systems. Now, that's not what we do at Citizens Climate Lobby. We focus a lot on carbon pricing. But before I get to that, I want to ask, how many of you have heard of EnROADS? It's a global policy simulator that now includes more than just energy, and it allows users to explore the impact of dozens of policies, such as electrifying transport, pricing carbon, improving agriculture practices. And they have hundreds of factors like energy prices, temperature, air quality, sea level rise. And it's a highly validated global modeling system. And I just wondered if any of you have heard of it, because we are going to be exploring it for a few moments, just about 5 minutes. It's an introduction, and next month, both in Canada and on and globally, we will be diving deeper into it. So has anybody heard of it before? All right, I think this is never heard of it. Yeah, it is very interesting. So Larry, if you were on the Canadian mailing list, you will learn more about it next month, but so will the international people. So I'm going to share it with you. Okay, so how many here want to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions as fast as possible? How many? Yeah, we all do, right? So, and what's the number one source? Again, just to keep us focused, it's burning fossil fuels, 85%. So keeping that in mind, we're going to go to the simulator. So what this is you can program it to, price coal or put a full price on carbon pollution. You can subsidize energy efficiency, electrification. You can create all sorts of policies. And what we generally like to do is ask people to say, what is your favorite policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So does somebody want to just shout one out? Anyone? What's your favorite policy?
Carbon pricing.
Of course, Kathy. There we go. Okay, so we've got a citizen climate lobbyist on the call. And look what happens when we price carbon pollution very high. Um, it was, I think it would be $300 by the end of the century, but by giving the money back to the people, it actually reduces inequality and also really reduces emissions. It's almost like a basic income supplement. And look at, you can see like what, look at this panel over here, the global primary sources of energy. Watch when there's no carbon price. Look how much coal, oil, and gas we're burning. You get that carbon price really high, and you can see them greatly diminish, and you can see renewables greatly expand. It does barely anything to nuclear, but look how much it takes off of global temperature and greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Okay, so take a full degree off of global temperatures. Oops, I actually subsidized it a bit. Okay, so that is one policy. Does anybody else want to say their favorite policy? And I'll put this in the chat. Anybody else want to say another policy? I live in a part of the world where they planted 10 million trees in the last 40 years. So let's see what happens if we maximized tree planting across the planet. If we could plant every single tree possible by the end of this century, we'd only decrease emissions by temperatures by 0.1 degrees. And if we preserved as much more as forest as possible, which is really critical because we need our old growth forests, again, it only shaves off another 0.1. Both of these things important to do for many reasons, but they don't get the
What about
emissions.
methane?
Methane, you want to look at
Yes,
methane?
yes.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's click on this. So when you click on the 3 dots here, just to get a further explanation, there's decrease or increase in greenhouse gas emissions from methane, nitrous oxide, and methane is released from sources like cows and agriculture, natural gas drilling and waste. Nitrous oxide comes from fertilizers, and the F gases come from industry and consumer goods. So you can really play with this, and I'm not all that qualified to do this, but let's really reduce methane as much as possible. It is important to get that out as much as possible out of our any fossil fuel infrastructure. We've got to make sure there's no leaks as much as possible. As well, we need to somehow be capturing the agricultural methane that's being produced, or whatever, or just have better land use practices. So yes, it brings it down 0.4 degrees. And I don't have time to teach you all the, the intricate ways to do this, but yeah, you can see that it does have a pretty good impact. So you can get training through Climate Interactive on how to do this, but does anybody else want to suggest a policy before we move on?
Technological carbon removal.
Technological carbon removal. Right now, that's about the capacity that we have and predicted to have. So we are going to be using carbon removal technology, but we cannot build any new fossil fuel infrastructure because it's just not as advertised. It will not support any new fossil fuel infrastructure. In fact, we have to unwind what we have. A lot of people like to maximize subsidies to renewables. That takes it down to 0.2 degrees. Others like to get rid of all the subsidies to coal, oil, and gas, which is the opposite of pricing. That does nothing because it's such a small amount. That's why getting the banks and the World Bank to actually, there where most of the funding comes from. That's why working at the bank and the World Bank is really important, getting them to do their thing. So yeah, this is the EnROADS policy simulator, and we will be diving deeper into that in training for our international volunteers in February. And I think we're probably going to revisit it again in April, but we have to discuss this with the volunteers. It's their decision, not ours. So yes, I've just discussed subsidy reform. And, and I hope you're starting to see that it's really important that we must make polluters pay. We need to regulate the domestic banks and reform the multilateral development banks. We do need tax reform, and we do need a global treaty, but most of our work, especially for those of us in the global north, is on making polluters pay. And we focus in on a carbon pricing policy where you gradually increase the price on carbon pollution over time. So you get it out to $150 USD a ton by 2030. You give all the money back to the people. This builds the political will to get that price high enough, and then include border carbon adjustment mechanisms in order to keep the to encourage other countries to price pollution. This gradually increasing price on carbon pollution gives us all time to readjust our lifestyles. Canada's policy began in 2018, and it will be $185 a ton. It began with negotiations in 2015, so people will have had 15 years to be able to plan for this $185 a ton, but not everybody plans. So there will be this need to give money back, and there will be other programs to support households and businesses as we adjust. As well, we need border carbon adjustment mechanisms to protect domestic industries. And these tariffs at the border, like a carbon price applied as commodities high in carbon cross our border from countries without a price on pollution. Yes, these will eventually apply, and they must take into consideration common but differentiated responsibilities. So global north countries will expected to pay a full price, medium economy countries like China a medium price, and low income countries a low price, and maybe perhaps a little bit of a delay. So we need to take that into consideration as we develop these global policies, and they are being taken into consideration. Know that if in 2019, if you were Canadian and you voted for a carbon pricing friendly politician, your vote was that year reduced carbon emissions by 34.2 CO2 tons equivalents. Look at just living car free for a year. It was only 2.4 tons. Very, very, this is a peer reviewed paper, and if you get the slides, you can go explore it yourself. Carbon pricing is very powerful. Also know that carbon pricing, the way we like to advocate for it, not only will get us close to the 2-degree target, will also increase well-being, reducing inequality, and alleviating poverty. And that's because the richest among us are very high energy users. So know that when you join us and you get trained by us, you get all these tools and you're constantly exposed to them. Month after month, we're kind of like a book club for carbon pricing geeks at Citizens Climate Lobby, and it's a lot of fun. Internationally, we meet on the second Tuesday of the month. Nationally, in my country, Canada, we meet circa the second Saturday of the month. Nationally, we meet on the Friday and the Thursday night, the Friday day before and the Thursday night before. But we meet month after month internationally on the second Tuesday, and we slowly move forward together. And the next 3 months, we'll be diving deeper on the international area into the EnROADS policy simulator. In March, we're going to have a very deep workshop on redirecting financial flows. And on April, we're still deciding what we're going to be doing, but I think it's going to be something to do with EnROADS again, but we have to get permissions from our volunteers and see what they think. In Canada, we're lobbying in Toronto on February 26th, and we're lobbying in Manitoba on April the 4th. And yeah, there'll be more to announce in February. And then when you work with us, you get trained under what we call the 5 levers of political will. A lot of our training really focuses on getting you ready to lobby and how to lobby as a citizen. And we also provide support and training for media. We have a letter to the editor writer here on the call right now. Kathy Page is like an amazing letter to the editor writer. We do grassroots outreach, group development, and grass tops engagement, but you get all that over time. And our next Get to Know Us call is on the 3rd Wednesday of the month in February. And it changes every month, and you'll get a lot more updates then. But I'll take this last couple minutes to answer any questions you may have, and I'll check the chat.
do you send this out to us? Because wow, you have given us a super jam-packed day here to listen to you, and it was a very high quality. And I guess I'm just not following, you know, I need a little more time to digest some of it.
Yeah, this is like you just received like 3 university classes in a row
Yeah,
in 1 hour. Absolutely. This is not for the lighthearted. So there's the slides, and I will email this one out to everybody today. I think this is the keeper today. Santiago, are you interested in getting connected?
I am. I looked to see if there's a chapter in Switzerland. I don't think there is. But yeah, I need to look a bit more on what's available, I guess.
Yeah, so at the there's again, like I said, Switzerland is really like one of those linchpin countries for us when we're thinking of carbon pricing, because the carbon pricing policy they have does give the money back to the people. So we do have groups in Switzerland that we work with. Is there actually a group? There actually should be a group, but I would highly recommend that you consider just joining the CCL Europe team. And if you are interested, they have their own Slack channel. Are you familiar with working in Slack? So they do a lot of their stuff on Slack. They meet every single Tuesday at, oh my goodness, I'm going to say 2 p.m. Eastern time, which I think is 8 p.m. CET, which is your time, Central European time. They meet at that time, and they each week has a different theme to it. So the second Tuesday is actually looking more with all your international colleagues. But other weeks is more focused on policies, or getting ready to lobby the EU, or getting ready to lobby at the country level. So they are doing comms, like they have a whole series of things that they do, and they're very organized and very structured, and could learn lots. And I'm sure they'd love to have somebody from Switzerland on their team.
I'll have to take a look.
Yeah, for sure. Look at the, I'll get you the website. Just
Okay.
give me a second here. So if you're international, good idea to look at the Citizens Climate Earth website. And from there, you can see all the, if you go to the Find Your Local Chapter, and then you go to the global websites at Find Your Local Chapter, you can see where the various chapters are. So this is the Citizens Climate Europe. We do not have a Switzerland website, but there's the Citizens Climate Europe. And here's the Canada one for those of you who are interested. And I know Neville and Catherine have their own countries. I know they know that already. So we're at canada.citizensclimatelobby.org. We have our own website, and we've been around since 2010. And you know that carbon pricing policy that every province has, but Montreal and British Columbia? We lobbied almost 800 times for that.
Wow.
Catherine McKenna said we were the reason they chose it.
Ooh.
Ooh, so we'd really appreciate some help defending it, because we are really shocked at the disinformation that is out there regarding it. But that, you know why they're doing it, right? Because it works, because it's powerful. That's why we're getting the pushback, and that's okay. I wouldn't want to be them. 100 years from now, those people are going to be judged so poorly. I feel really sorry for them. It's really pathetic, actually. Those who are pushing back against this at this point in time, after all those forest fires this summer, to continue to slam the most powerful policy we have that took 3 years to negotiate with the Canadian people. It was literally 3 years of like citizen engagement, like government, like they did so much work, and to try to trash it. Oh well, I'm not them, so I'm not worried. I know it's sad for them.
Premiers are really, it's pathetic. The premiers in this, oh la la, oh la la.
Look, Okay, this is something really interesting that most Canadians probably don't know, and I think the rest of the world should know. Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, was a lawyer for the Confederate Army during the Civil War in the United States. The Confederate Army that wanted to keep slavery, he was a lawyer for them. Etienne Cartier, Canada's first deputy prime minister, from Quebec, was a lawyer for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Our first finance minister was a lawyer for the Confederate Army. So as the Canadian, they loved the Southern United States idea that provinces or states should have much powers, because they didn't believe in central powers. So that's why we have such a hard time with our premiers, because the provinces have more powers than the prime minister, and then they go, oh, it's the prime minister's fault, but when in fact it's the premier's fault. So for those of you who live in provinces that have, that aren't as horrible as some of the other premiers like Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So Quebec and Manitoba and British Columbia, like, keep pushing your premiers to keep pushing that edge out. So for example, at COP28, the Premier of Quebec took a leadership role at the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. So, we're in a very complex system, but knowing that our whole system here in Canada, the first 3 people that designed, the top echelon of people, were actually lawyers for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. We're polite and nice, but there's like a very bad undercurrent here. But most people don't know it because we're so shielded from it, because we're so blessed with natural resources and a fairly healthy democracy. But deeper, when you dig deeper, there's some things we should address. Oh, there's your history lesson. You can go at any time. I can go on. Thanks, everyone.